Last week we discussed the new Federal Reserve final rule to Regulation Z as it pertains to loan officer compensation. Now, assertion was, and still is, that the rule creates more questions than answers, leaving mortgage brokers, bankers, wholesalers, and all other entities that fund real estate mortgages dumbfounded as to how to set up a system of compensation that's going to keep them compliant. Now, as a result, and as it stands, real estate funding is now positioned to hit the skids come April 1st when this new rule is set to be implemented.
Along with our video, the Office of Advocacy, a congressionally formed government entity who is established to advocate for small businesses like your small banks out there, wrote a letter to the Federal Reserve petitioning them for a plain English clarification of the rule, as they, the Federal Reserve, is under legal obligation per the RFA and the SBREFA.
Along with the Office of Advocacy, and with your help sending our message to Washington, the Federal Reserve Board wrote a compliance guide to help clarify the rule. The problem is, here's what we got. A 4-page document that's nothing more than a 1-paragraph summary of Reg Z, a 1-paragraph summary of the truth in lending, a 2-page cut and paste as to who the rule covers, and 1 page that summarizes the rule.
4 pages? 4 pages to clarify something that legal experts from across the country can't even figure out? They don't address the concerns voiced by all the mortgage lending associations, the banking and brokering entities, and loan officers alike. Nothing! I mean, to be candid, this feels like a half-witted attempt to appease the Office of Advocacy so they can move forward with a rule that, as we've said before, will bring the mortgage lending and our housing recovery to a screeching halt. Now look around and ask yourself this. Is this something we can afford?
Our goal is simple. We want reform. The industry wants reform. Washington wants reform. But most importantly, the consumer. They demand and deserve reform. Now, our pushback, it's not with the spirit of the rule, but rather the design and catastrophic consequences of not getting this thing right.
Immediately following is our previous video discussing and outlining what the rule is and the problems it, make no mistake, will create.
Okay, listen guys, this video, it needs to be viewed by everybody, especially our legislators. So, at the conclusion of this video, please forward it to your sphere of influence and encourage them to continue the chain of forwards.
Over here on your right, there's a list of all your legislators and their email addresses. So together, we can light the match that creates the fire and hopefully will catch the attention of those in power that are currently complicit, allowing our housing recession to continue. Here it goes. Hope you enjoy it.
On December 16th, the Mortgage Bankers Association sent a letter to Ben Bernanke and Sandra Bronstein of the Federal Reserve Board asking them for written clarification on the Fed's rule to regulate loan officer compensation. The MBA's contention is that without clarification, where true understanding is blurred in so many areas, lenders may be forced to be very conservative and implement compensation and loan pricing structures that provide for fixed compensation for originators at a level that can only be supported by higher loan prices for the consumer.
Well, the truth of the matter is that's simply where the problem begins. As everyone in the lending community knows, the Federal Reserve Board rule on compensation has left lenders and loan officers alike clamoring for an understanding of what the tolerance thresholds will be and what reasonable but misread and implemented interpretation of the rule will cause. As evidence of our contention, you simply need to look around at the complete silence from the lending community as to the direction any of them will take, assumably April 1st, when this broad sweeping compensation reform is set to kick off.
Let's be clear, this rule has left lenders in the dark and downright fearful of drawing any conclusions that will allow them to go forward, continue lending, creating liquidity, and helping our recovery. Simply put, as it stands, this rule will create the unintended consequences of roadblocks to home ownership. And guys, that's unacceptable.
So, on January 13th, Winslow Sargent, the Chief Counsel for Advocacy, and Jennifer Smith, Assistant Chief Counsel for Economic Regulation and Banking, both of the Office of Advocacy, sent a letter to the Federal Reserve asking them for clarification of the final rule on Regulation Z as it pertains to loan officer compensation. Now, to understand who they are, the Office of Advocacy was established by Congress to represent the views of small business before federal agencies like the Federal Reserve and Congress.
In the letter from the Office of Advocacy and through the RFA, which mandates the Federal Reserve agencies consider the potential economic impact of federal regulations on small entities like your banks, and the SBREFA, which requires agencies to provide plain English compliance guides to clearly explain each final rule that has a significant economic impact on small entities. Through this authority, they've asked the Federal Reserve to publish a compliance guide at earliest the date the final rule was announced, which they didn't do, or prior to its implementation, which I highly doubt they can accomplish.
Without the required clarification, it would appear that the Federal Reserve would be acting upon no authority. Let me clarify this. They would be acting outside of the law established by Congress. So the Federal Reserve needs to start playing by the rules and comply, or they need to step back and shelf Reg Z compensation.
Interestingly, the Federal Reserve has SBREFA compliance on its website for all these regulations, but strangely, zero compliance, none for Reg Z. Yet that's precisely what they've tasked themselves to do.
Listen, our motivation is clear. This rule is bad for the industry, but more importantly, it's bad for consumers. The rule does not stem the flow of money, it simply diverts the channels where money will eventually pool. As a result, the consumer will be faced with less transparency of the money that changes hands in their transaction and will not bring the cost or the rate down at all.
Though we accept the fact that the Federal Reserve cannot see the consequences of their rule, we would insist they work within the laws of our government. That is, simply comply, provide the industry with a plain English clarification to all the questions everyone has, do it in writing, do it before April 1st, or start making paper airplanes with the rule and chuck them from the Federal Reserve building, ironically enough, on Constitution Avenue.